Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, the 9th of August, and you are watching episode 98 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, the Burdekin Basin, potential or problem, is my guest, Professor Alan Dale. Alan is a professor of tropical regional development at Cairns Institute, James Cook University, and is the chief scientist for the Cooperative Research Centre for Developing Northern Australia. He is also a university fellow with the Charles Darwin University, Northern Institute, and has a strong interest in integrated societal governance with a particular focus across the tropical world, Northern Australia, and the Great Barrier Reef. Alan leads JCU's contributes to Queensland Rural Economy Centre of Excellence and the Northern Development Agenda. He has both extensive research and policy expertise in building a strong governance system, but particularly in those related to regional economic development, social development, and natural resource management. Alan was previously a member of the Federal Government's Advisory Group on Northern Australia, as well as the past chair of Regional Development Australia, Far North Queensland, and Torres Straits, and previously CEO of Terrain Natural Resources Management. Alan has also held executive and management roles within Queensland's Department of Natural Resources and Mines and the Department of Community Services. He has also had global experience in respect to development issues. Welcome, Alan.
Good to see you again, Bill. I should have held out to be number 100, but 98's pretty good.
Well, we're getting there. We have our up and downs with getting guests on here and there. Look, it's good to have you back. This episode is a little bit different. We've got to concentrate on water. But if we just touch on your past episode in regards to, we're talking about development process for projects in regional Australia and basically northern Queensland. There was a general assumption that there is a bit of hold up with a lot of projects and things like that. Do you think the process has gotten any better in the last couple of years?
I think it's a good time to recap, Bill. Actually, I think our last talk was around about 18 months or 2 years ago, and we've had change of government since then, not just one, but several governments across the north, and we are sort of further down the track in terms of how was the original white paper rolling out, and so I think it gives us time to pause and reflect about how the overall implementation of the white paper for developing Northern Australia is travelling. Also just come out of the Developing North Australia conference in Darwin about 2 weeks ago. I've been chairing that now for 9 years, and that's that chance every year to come together across all of the major players in Northern Australia, together with governments, Northern Territory, West Australian and Queensland, and the federal government, to talk about how is the process going and how is implementation actually travelling. So some big things have happened in the last 18 months. There's been a reformation of the Ministerial Forum for Northern Australia, with the new Labor government coming into power. That's quite an important development, because if we don't have really strong COAG-like, Council of Australian Governments-like conversations about the North, then we fall off the agenda pretty quickly, Bill. So I'm sort of quite pleased that the Ministerial Forum has been re-established and it's just getting going. The Indigenous Reference Group has been reinstitutionalised and continuing. And the new government in the last budget just announced it will be doing a fairly significant refresh of the white paper. So it's a chance right now to be starting to say what's worked and what hasn't worked. Just in reflection of that and sort of picking up on some of the big themes coming out of the conference of the last few days, I think the first to spell out is that the original white paper had about 4 or 5 big bits. So let's think about what worked and what didn't work so well about that. So one big bit was the major enabling infrastructure packages. So that came through in the form of what was called the Beef Roads package and the Strategic Roads package. And that eventually turned into something like the Regional Roads of Strategic Importance Initiative, the ROSI initiative. And the basic framework of that were large connecting bits of infrastructure across the north. They worked on largely an 80-20 split between Commonwealth and state, and they generally were partnered well with the state governments and with the regional local communities. So I still chair, for example, the Cape York Infrastructure Package, which is now into its second stage, likely to go into its third stage. So that was a part of the white paper that's actually worked pretty well and had quite a big significant impact. And so we think it is time to start thinking much more seriously about the next major enabling infrastructure package. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more lately, because we had a lot of conversation around that at the conference. You know, how do we increase that connectivity from the east to the west? How do we connect our remote and Indigenous communities much more fairly and equitably? How do we get much greater supply chain linkage into the Indo-Pacific? They're the sort of focus issues for us on that sort of agenda going forward. Then the second big agenda in the North Australian stuff was the North Australia Infrastructure Facility. So that was the $5 billion concessional loans facility. And it's gone through quite radical change, because for a lot of reasons, there was slowness in the uptake of that concessional loans facility. So a lot of changes have happened to make it more flexible, make it more available for pooled projects, making it more accessible to smaller projects rather than just large corporates. And we've got a new management team there with Craig Doyle and Tracy Hayes as chair. And they're doing, in my view, quite a great job of getting out there and actually making that concessional loans facility work. But the big problem that it faced was that to get to the loans end of development cycle, you need a pipeline of development from the ideas on the ground through to get through the planning processes and land use planning processes, to go through the tenure resolution that's required, to build the partnerships required to make the project work, to turn that into feasibility and to turn that into an investable project. And then the possibility of having multiple lines of investment, not just the NAIF, you know. So there was a third part of the package, which was the CRC for North Australia, which is, I think, now spent its money and done a good job doing that. And that's coming to a close at the moment as well. So one of the things we're particularly concerned about going forward is making sure that in the next iteration of the white paper, we've got more the pipeline of investment required to build the proposals that can get to the NAIF and then can be brokered across private sector finance or things like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation or the Regional Investment Corporation, and something that's much better at actually picking up the small to medium parts of the economy, which is so crucial because we're really a small to medium economy with some big chunky bits, particularly from the resources sector. So that's probably the third part I'd be saying is next time around, we probably need to be thinking about how we invest in making the pipeline of investment work. And that means keeping going with research and analysis work, doing a lot more collaboration building, particularly across supply chains, doing much more of the regional land use planning to get through these really complex conflicting problems within the landscape, really investing and supporting traditional owners in terms of their role within the development process, and seeing that invested through feasibility work that gets us to the investment cycle. So I'll sort of wrap it up by saying, look, some things have worked pretty well, some things didn't work so well. Next round, I think we've got to see more of this major enabling infrastructure stuff. I think we've got to see much more focus on getting that pipeline of investment in place. And then at the back of all of that, with traditional owners having some 78% of the landscape under particular rights and 100% of the landscape in interest, they're a key part of the development process and need to be equity partners going forward in most of this stuff. So how do we really invest in building that traditional owner governance support and the capacity of traditional owner interest and Indigenous business to be a bigger part of the development outcome? So lots of big things to focus on for the future, and the refresh over the next year or 18 months is the chance to get some of those things well embedded in the next generation of the white paper's life.
I suppose the small picture items I'm sort of interested in is getting rid of roadblocks and things like that in regards to, like you say, conflicting interests, ways to sort of make sure we don't we want to move in a certain direction and develop certain projects, but if there's roadblocks in the way, we need to at least address those so things can progress more smoothly.
Yeah.
We've got situations like, and it still gives me irrits in regards to things like the PDF going up to Weipa or up to the tip. I went up there in 2017, and the rework was there. Now, from Cohen to Weipa, I drove over 26 sections of bitumen and 26 sections of tar, basically. Some new works, some still old works. Andrew's just gone up there recently. It's obviously they've advanced more work, but it still has a lot of those things. I mean, to me, the roadblock there is the thinking in regards to why are you trying to patch up or rework a single lane or a single dual carriageway that's gravel, and on the same road you actually using at the same time. You know, to me, there has to be some logic as well. All right, let's leave this road here, and 50 metres to the left, let's put a new road up, and that's not going to interfere with the traffic, and it's not going to be held up through. Those sort of things, you know, logistics type things that sort of need to be sorted out too. But like I say, there's small picture, whereas you're looking at the bigger picture. But I would like to see some of those small picture things addressed as well.
Well, it's actually a good chance to talk about the PDR, the Peninsula Development Road work a little bit, Bill, because I think that's a really important example of some of the things that have been radically different from the past. So, but the other bigger picture issue that you're saying, and one that you know that I'm very interested in, is Northern Australia is quite an unplanned landscape in the sense of the federal government, state governments, territory government and local communities reaching agreement about where they'd like to see development happen, how they'd like to see it happen, where they'd like to see landscapes protected, and how do you sort of get, you know, the flow of ecosystem service markets to make the landscape actually work from an environmental point of view. So that's another issue I'll park, because I'm happy to talk about that one in a lot of detail, because it's something I'm very convinced we need to get right, because the Northern Australian landscape is absolutely contested, you know. So there's contested between environmental values, cultural values, economic development opportunity, and we can get that right, but it will take 3 layers of government and the regional community and industry all working together with traditional owners to agree how to move that forward. And then that, like anywhere, sets the planning framework for where investment can occur, and it sets the framework for where infrastructure goes. My biggest concern about what do we do to drive investment in the north is if we don't get that right, every individual project has to run through a gauntlet of conflict, and the private sector just can't really take those sorts of risks. So it is so crucial to get that right, and it's probably one of my biggest reform agendas that you'll hear me bang on about endlessly. But I particularly want to see a big focus on that in the next iteration of the white paper.
Well, my opinion is what it's worth. I think there's not enough input from the regions themselves and the expertise in the regions. And I think the people who make decisions, or the bureaucrats that are down in Canberra and maybe Brisbane, need to be dragged up here and put out in the bush for 6 to 12 months and made to look at, well, this is the landscape you people are dealing with. Get some local expertise, talk to local expertise, instead of using your offices in Canberra and Brisbane, air conditioned, and getting in consultants from Price Waterhouse, from people, real people on the ground.
Oh, well, you know my strong views on that, Bill. You got to invest in regions directly to make this stuff happen. And so it's how do state and federal governments partner the region and invest in the regional institutions to make this work, because we're the ones that have to make the decisions at the end of the day. So no point exporting that to Canberra or Brisbane or Perth or somewhere else. You've got to go long, hard haul, invest in the regional planning capability, and that means getting the regional institutions right and making sure that we've got strong local governments sitting behind that to help the development assessment processes. I'm happy to pick up the PDR stuff a bit, Bill, because
Yeah, we'll get onto that towards at the end, because we'll talk about a few different projects and that. But if we can just move to the core topic of tonight, it's the Burdekin Basin. So if I could just start off with sharing a screen. And this is basically Australia's mainland rainfall. So people can get the general idea of what we're talking about as far as water catchment areas, and then especially in relation to the Burdekin Basin. This is a map of Australian rainfall, and good old Tasmania, it must be around, it's 13% of the Australia's rainfall. And so this is the mainland Australia's rainfall catchment areas. And northwest is 26% of all rainfall goes out basically into the Timor Sea. The Gulf gets areas, 26% again goes into the Gulf areas, and then about 24% goes into the Coral Sea. And that, so you can see, as far as Australia's total rainfall, Northern Australia gets more than 75%. And when you think, a lot of people talk about the Murray-Darling Basin and how it's an economic food bowl. Well, it only gets 6.1% of the mainland rainfall. So you can see that we've got a lot of potential with water, and whether we're getting the best out of it, we're not too sure of.
Well, it's a good slide to kick off, Bill, and I've got probably a good way to sort of kick into that in terms of discussion of the recent Bradfield review, because I think that sort of sets the scene for the positive opportunity that we have in Northern Australia. So if you're happy for me to get into that, I'm happy to kick off.
Well, the Bradfield scheme really, if you go back to the original one, it basically did get all the way up to the Burdekin Basin as the most northerly point. One of my issues in regards to the Bradfield scheme or the second, third, fourth iterations is that it doesn't look far enough north, because there's more water to the north again. But yeah, the Burdekin Basin is probably the starting point for the original Bradfield scheme, and it was the same for the last reiteration for the 2020 federal election, with a bit of pomp and ceremony and carry on about Hell's Gate, which I'm not a fan of.
So I think if we start off with the Bradfield, that tells the story of both the opportunity, but also how we have to be cautious in terms of coming up with the right development models. And that flows into, what that conversation about what is the future for the Burdekin, because I think Burdekin's got a very bright future, but we have to get the model for development of the Burdekin fundamentally right as well. So I'm happy to kick off into that, because I think talking about the Bradfield proposal and the recent review of that proposal and what it means for Northern Australia and Northern Queensland in particular is really a telling way to think about the fact that we've got this great opportunity, but that we've got to sort of now think about how we go from having done water allocation plans to get the best value out of the water that's actually allocated. And it's quite a substantial amount of water allocated for consumptive use across that whole North Queensland region. So that slide you put up at the start is really useful to say Northern Queensland actually is the place where we could be the point of providing drought resilience for the rest of the country if we get our models of water development right. But what we don't want to do is just repeat the mistakes we made in the Murray-Darling from the past. So huge opportunity, but great caution to make sure we don't repeat what we did down south. And that will, I think, if we get that right, Northern Queensland in particular can really be the powerhouse of economic development, I think, for the country for many years, next 50 years going forward. and particularly when we tie the energy and water story together. But it's going to take a much more sophisticated way of thinking about how we go about that water development. So
I think the other thing is too, the last reiteration of the Bradfield scheme was a bit partisan in regards to, it was really a carry by the Conservative or LNP or whatever, more so than Labor. And if we go forward, we really have to have a grand vision, and that's bipartisan in the first instance. So we don't have that, well, then you just got to have a bum fight all the time, and people just got to snipe at it, and you'll never get anywhere.
Bipartisan and bilateral, Bill. So, you know, both parties and broader society together with both governments, you know, federal and state governments. And this is why the Bradfield story is very useful, right? So, as you know, the previous election, maybe 2 elections ago, there was, you know, a coalition commitment to build the Bradfield, to actually not so much assess it, but actually build. Labor won that particular election, but there was something in the narrative that really needed to be dealt with, and that was that there is real opportunity in northern Queensland with the water that's allocated for very significant economic development to occur, and that you couldn't just look at the Bradfield scheme, say it wasn't going to work, and then say, well, nothing should happen, right? So Anthony Lynham was the minister at that stage, and he appointed the Bradfield Review Committee, which was myself, and at the end, myself, Ross Garnaut was the chair. There's the report that we produced at the end of late last year. Ross Garnaut chaired it. I was one of the committee members. You send
me the link to that one, and I'll put it up on the.
I'll send that through. And Georgina Davis, who was head of Queensland Farmers Federation at the time. So it was a great panel, very independent panel, very considered panel in my view. I love working with those guys over that period of time. And we started with the view that there is this very significant opportunity, right? So the aspiration behind people talking about Bradfield reflected the fact that regional communities see that there is a big opportunity. The major proponents of what was then called the Great Dividing Range Scheme, which was a variation of the old Bradfield, you know, Leo Hilscher, who was really key in the development of the state through the mining industry, Frank Moore, who was key leader in the tourism industry. Both those guys had a real passion for the development of the state. And so we had to be quite respectful of that in the sense of what they were trying to achieve. But then you have to come to the cold, hard reality of how does that scheme stack up with the current world? Because the original Bradfield scheme was developed in the 30s, as you know. And since that time, in the Burdekin in particular, many, many things have changed. Well, first of all, we built the Burdekin Falls Dam, and we allocated very significant amounts of water to the sugar industry in particular down in the lower Burdekin. So there's effectively 1,000 gigalitres already allocated to water development within the Burdekin, and much of that is in the lower Burdekin system. And then, of course, in the meantime, we actually realised environment is actually important. We started increasingly realising Indigenous cultural values in water and rights to water are important. We've started to recognise that there's many other uses of water going on in the Burdekin for industry and other things. And because of the big stuff-ups in the Murray-Darling, around about 20 to 30 years ago, we developed the thing called the National Water Initiative, which said we don't want the Murray-Darlings type thing to happen again in the future. So under the National Water Initiative, Queensland started developing water plans around about 20 years ago. A lot of that started down south, and then it sort of came up north. Burdekin's was done quite a while ago. And that's actually been a really quite robust process, you know, relatively well engaged across all the major players. It does all the science to look at sort of what are the environmental flow requirements you need for the river to keep functioning. It does all of the assessment about what do you need to keep security of existing irrigators. What's the water that's available for future allocation? And it sort of tries to bring that all together in a statutory framework. So we have to sort of start with the water plans as being the best available knowledge, a lot of good modelling and a lot of good existing data, so real data. So it's quite a robust framework for thinking about these things, and it's compliant with national agreements about these things. So when you start looking at a major project like the Bradfield or Hell's Gate as a proposal in its own right, the first place to start is how much water is available under the water plan. And then you might ask yourself, is the water plan robust and reasonably, well based? And then you say, well, would a proposal that tries to take 3,000 gigalitres out of the Upper Burdekin and the Herbert and Tully, does that stack up against the water plan? And unfortunately for the Bradfield scheme, the answer is no. So on the back of relatively robust water planning processes, there is water allocated for further development in the Upper Burdekin, but it certainly is not 3,000 gigalitres of water. And there's water allocated in the Upper Herbert and the Upper Tully, but it's certainly not 1,000 plus gigalitres of water available. Now, if we were to develop proposals of that amount of water, we would ultimately push the river into unsustainable territory in environmental terms. But probably far more importantly, the first major players who would complain would be the irrigators at the Lower Burdekin, who would have massively reduced security of their reliability of their irrigation allocations in that part of the region. So it has big flow-on effects if you're going to take water out to that extent. But what we found was to say, look, okay, this is the reality for the Bradfield, and that has implications, of course, for Hell's Gates as well. But we think North Queensland has really incredibly strong opportunities. And so we started looking at the entire region from Bundaberg north. And when you really look through all of the plans and the water that's available for allocation and development, it's very substantial. So in the Cape, there's around about 518 gigalitres of water available. In the Mitchell, there's still around about 75 to 100 gigalitres. In the Gilbert, there's around about 464 gigalitres available for allocation for consumptive use. And I can keep going, but right throughout northern and central Queensland, there's really still quite substantial water available. And the other thing to be really clear about is that our productivity from every megalitre of water we use at the moment is relatively low compared to other states, New South Wales and Victoria. So it in my view, and in the view of the panel, says what really are the development opportunities ahead of us? How would we go about really planning that out? And then how would we get long-term investment programs to make that happen? So we pretty much identified 4 regions where we think if you really take the water that's available, think through every option for water development, you compare them against their social, economic, environmental desirability and or impact. You work with the regional community, who are the ones that ultimately are the ones responsible for water development. You work with the feds, the state, regional communities, major stakeholders in the regions, and you come up with a really clear agreement about what are the development processes that need to happen to develop the water that's actually available. Sometimes that might be infrastructure. Sometimes it might be reasonably large infrastructure, but quite often it might be also lots of small bits of infrastructure in the right places. It might be actually getting the trading system working to really increase the amount of flexibility in our water system. It might be about doing research and development to lift up the productivity of the water that we've got. It might be about getting much greater value add to the existing product we have. So there are many things that we can do and should do to take advantage of the water that's available, plus the new water that is there for allocation. So we've identified 4 regions. We call it the water zone, Tablelands, Cairns, Burdekin, Townsville, Rockhampton, Fitzroy, Gladstone, and Bundaberg, Burnett region, Bundaberg, as 4 regions. If we get this right and we connect it up with the way we think about energy and energy development, and we really try to lift up the level of investment along agreed principles, that they will potentially become the powerhouses of economic development in the next 10 to 50 years.
I can see that, but see, all the things you said there, Bundaberg, Rockhampton, Townsville, and the Tablelands here, it still misses.
Now, I'm going to get to the second bit first.
There needs to be a 5th.
Yeah, well, this is where you get to recommendation 5, or I think it is. I can't remember the recommendation number, but that's our first part, is focus on those big ones in terms of making that really work, and potentially look at maybe even creating mini grids to connect that system and make it much more secure a little bit like in southeast Queensland, where we've got much more secure system. But then we say there are all the other regions who are the intended beneficiaries of Bradfield. So the Gulf in particular, Lake Eyre Basin, Cape York, Mackay Whitsunday actually as well, which is nearly fully allocated, but actually has water potentially available through a lot of other different processes. So we say very strongly in those regions, you need to take this whole of catchment approach. We call it the making water work approach, and resolve those problems that are the impediments to water development in those regions, right? So I'm going to use one of the regions in that to tell you the story of woe that needs to be resolved before we can actually see water use allocated. And that's the Gilbert River, where there's 464 gigalitres of water allocated for development. It's very unclear where that development can occur because of the environmental constraints and the Vegetation Management Act. It's also very unclear about the type of development that won't have a major impact on the prawning industry. And we don't know that much about the science of that region to get those things right. So we will never resolve the right model for development if we don't get the state government, federal government, and the regional community working really hard together to reach an agreed model for the development of the Gilbert that's going to work. I'm confident we can do that, but we currently don't have the planning framework for water development that lets that happen. And that's just Gilbert's one example. If we don't get that right, this is where we're headed, Bill, and I think you know this quite well. We'll see continued economic decline in those communities in the Gilbert. We'll see we'll see continued environmental decline because of lack of investment in cohesive environmental management through whether it's burning regimes or weeds and ferals or inappropriate grazing in the wrong places. And we'll see traditional owners sitting there without being engaged in the economic opportunity going forward, now that they've all got their native title back and are ready to be part of the future of that region. So that's the scenario we have. But if we get the planning of this right, that region has an incredibly bright future. And this is the big shift I'm looking for, is to go from no consensus about how development can occur to some strong consensus about the right development model, but development models that actually work for the 21st century, not for, the 1850s. So I think as a panel, we were very strongly saying North Queensland, with strong support from the feds, is very much the place where this can happen in a nationally significant way.
Well, the interesting thing, about 2017, I went across over the Gilbert River. I travelled to out to Croydon, up to Normanton and that, and it's quite amazing, really. You're going across this sort of open, dry plains area with scrubby looking bush, and then you just hit this oasis that is the Gilbert River, and you've got all these mango trees and things like that, and you just think, gee, why can't we do more of that? And I suppose that's the thing that we've got to look for. But the other thing is, but farmers and that are very innovative. We've got lakelands going at the moment, and you've got people up there like Sean Jackson, who was a developer of the seedless watermelon, and also broccolini or something. And I think one of his latest things was the Orange Glow pumpkin that's higher in keratin and vitamin K, which is good for the eyes, so they can break down to a powder sort of thing. But they do a lot of the vegetable growing in boxes, like they build it off the ground and they only have a drip feed, so they're not using a lot of water. It's not like you go at the tablelands and they've got these big sprinkler systems going all the time, sort of thing. So it's very economical in the water use. So
it's a good reason why
the industry is very innovative.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good reason why I talk about getting the development model right? Because that next generation of development, in a lot of ways, you can actually probably do it in a way that circularizes the nutrients back in the system and actually ends up potentially cleaning the system up. If we're able to facilitate that type of really well knowledge-based integrated sort of approach to development. And to be honest, that's really high value development, and it's where the investment world is going as well. So the investment world doesn't want to invest in old style reef polluting investment anymore. It's not what farmers want to do either. But we need that real support within the region to pull that model of development off. So you've probably seen just in the last couple of weeks, Peter Inderbitson and his work on the sort of mushroom growing facility there at Lakeland. They're
Actually,
doing
I tried.
really high
They're
value
Swedish.
stuff.
They're Swedish background or something like Swedish background, I think.
Very high
Scandinavian.
value stuff. Yeah. Very efficient use of water. And very high value and very high employment outcomes as well, So
I did approach them to come
incredibly big
on
future.
and have a bit of a talk. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I
Well,
think there was a big story about them about 6 months ago, and I tried to approach it. I did approach them and try to encourage them to come on, but they seem to be a bit reclusive. I don't know, it must be the Swedish in them. But if we can just now touch on the Burdekin Basin, I'll just put a screen up.
Yeah.
This is the area. This is the area we're talking about. We're going all the way up to right past Ingham, going down almost in the coalfields. So it's a huge area. So it'd probably be one of the biggest catchment areas in Australia. And of course it all centres around the Burdekin Falls Dam in the middle. And I think Hell's Gate somewhere up here or near Charters Towers. It's only a small potato as far as the overall catchment area is. Do you think it was probably a mistake in regards to the focus on the Hell's Gate rather than just looking at the whole Burdekin, where when they were a bit focused with Bob's, getting Bob's case up for Hell's Gate and things like that? You think that sort of did a bit of harm, more harm than good in regards to the Burdekin?
I'd say yes.
Too.
Yes.
Well, that was pretty.
Distracted the regional community for a good 7 to 8 years on something that could never have happened, Bill, quite frankly, because you've got to come back to the foundations of the water planning arrangements, right? And this is one of the reasons I'm a very strong advocate of much better water development planning, because if you do a water plan, allocates water for use, effectively then it just becomes a free-for-all, lots of ideas. It's a contest of ideas and projects. And if you don't plan that out as a regional community, you might get all these strange ideas coming from all over the place. And the vast majority of people don't quite understand the water planning framework. So it means you can get ideas that pop up that on day one, anyone who knows anything about water allocation planning would say there is simply not enough water available for that particular development under the water plan. So those in periods of weak governance, those ideas get traction and maybe get investment and from one government or another, and we end up not on the same page about what's possible. But at the end of the day, had that proposal continued, there would have been very significant risk of it actually not being approved through Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act anyway. And so it could have been that one part of government is investing in something that would have to be turned down by another part of government because of its straight out regulatory obligations. Quite utopian in the way that it works. But this is why we need to have a cohesive vision about the future development of our regions. Because if we're all on the same page about what's the right model for development, we don't go off on big wild goose chases for what might seem like fantastic, exciting projects that simply do not take account of the reality of the amount of water that is available for development.
But it didn't take into account of the reality of costs in the long run for what it was.
I always go, Bill, no point talking about costs if the water is not available. So let's start with the facts. If there is water, and yes, the water plans are always able to be reviewed and sort of reassessed and get new science into them, get new engagement in them. They can always be played around with, but it's only going to get harder in terms of water allocation in the future than it is easier, right? So we've got to account in the next iteration of our water planning. So Burdekin Water Plan is coming up for a review at the moment, is in review process. We've got to start accounting for what the real impact of climate change is. And in the Bradfield review, we look pretty seriously at not just the predicted models of climate risk, but the actual changes of precipitation and flow over the last 20 to 30 years. And we're going to have to be a little bit more conservative because of that. And then there's a whole lot of other new environmental issues that need to be thought about. There's a lot more security issues that need to be thought about. So water plan reviews are not likely to suddenly throw up many, many thousands of megalitres of water into the system. But this is also where there are some great opportunities. And one good example here is a high flows allocation in the wet tropics, around about 1,500,000 to 1,500 gigalitres of water potentially available under high flows allocations in the wet tropics. We don't quite have the technology to sort of capture, store and utilise that at the moment, but there are real possibilities around the corner that we might be able to start to do that consistent with the water plan. And then we're starting to talk quite significant development opportunities, but with small to medium infrastructure investments. If we can get that right in places like the wet tropics and potentially transfer some of those ideas into other parts of the Burdekin, then we're talking about hyper-secure irrigation systems, which would be the envy of investors globally. They're the opportunities ahead for us, and we're going to have to think pretty carefully about how we can pull that off.
I think one of the big things about the northern rivers is the rainfall that it comes over a very short period and a great volume sort of thing. So I call it rush and dust. I mean, you have the wet season, you have fast flowing rivers, just pouring out to the oceans and that lasts for maybe a couple of months, and then the residual goes away. And then those riverbeds can basically just turn into a trickle or just little ponds along the thing. And I don't think rush and dust or bust is a very good way to sort of manage your water. And I think that's where water storage comes into play, whether it's a series, even on a small scale, a series of weirs that at least pond a good portion of the water, keep your wetlands. And last year I also had a conversation with the people up at the Ord River, because a lot of people still look at that as a white elephant to a degree, because it hasn't delivered the economic benefits a lot of people thought. But there again, I think it's probably the wrong people. If we had got all those boat people who came here in the 70s from Vietnam and put them up there, they probably would have made a real go of that up there. But it's interesting, the two dam system with you got the Lake Argyle Dam, and then you got the 55 kilometres down the river, you've got the irrigation barrage dam sort of thing. So that portion of water from the Ord River Dam at the Lake Argyle down to 55 kilometres down the river, that can be kept at a constant level. And one of the benefits from that is it's put a permanent wetlands there. There's been an increase in bird life, not only in the numbers, but also the number of species. And it's also been a great benefit to other local fauna and flora as well. So, and that's a method of sort of, in a small scale, of breaking that cycle of rush and bust sort of thing, and dust. And it also, it saves a lot of things further downstream in regards to Wyndham that used to get quite big flows through before the dams were there. So I think there's a proof of concept in the Ord River, even though it hasn't been the economic success, but I think it is a proof of concept for going forward in the future as well.
Yeah, I often talk about the Ord as being a fantastic place where you'd do this making water work development planning process, where you sort of say, because look, the reality is you'd never see something like the Ord built again today because of the major environmental and other impacts that you just don't want to have any more. But it's there and it's able to be used, and there's significant water, which is available for allocation and available for use. So there are a lot of other constraints in the Ord that have sort of meant it hasn't taken off in terms of the full availability of water. But there are lots of things that we can do when we plan it well in terms of actually getting much better use of that water that's actually there. So there's still need for bits of ancillary infrastructure and new development opportunity, all that sort of stuff. But it's a classic example where you would say there's water available, but how do we overcome all these? how we overcome all of these constraints to its allocation and use. This is where I think, coming back to the Burdekin, let's have a look at the bits and pieces of water that are potentially available in the system. So quite a lot of water available, as you know, and allocated in the lower Burdekin, but quite a lot of underutilization of that water. So there's no regrets, in my view, in terms of really starting to invest and support the industry in that region to start looking at how they get much better value and full utilisation of the water they actually have allocated. So you also tend to would say, if you've got water that's allocated not being used, why would you build another dam in a hurry? So, because then you just create more water, which might end up getting underutilised as well. But that would be one area where you put a lot of focus to try to really think through the ways to get much better value for the water that we've got in the lower Burdekin. Government is going through the process at the moment of doing the impact assessment for the raising of the Burdekin Falls Dam by 2 metres. In my view, that's not an unreasonable thing to do, because there is a need to make significant investment in the safety upgrades. And if you can combine that with capture of more water, and there's 150 gigalitres available for further allocation in that part of the region. So it's not an unreasonable thing, but a lot of thinking now needs to be done to how to get the best value out of that and how we use that most effectively. There are around about 150 gigalitres of water in the sort of Bowen system. There's probably about another 130 in the Belyando Sutter. And then, as you know, Charters Towers is thinking about the work that it needs to do in terms of Big Rocks Weir. So there's a generation of major water development and serious thinking about getting the best value out of that water ahead of us. And it brings me to the idea of not just that we need to do that planning well, looking at the water we have available, looking at all the options for getting better value for its use. Then I think there's an institutional problem, Bill, and this comes back to your constant theme about lifting the capacity of the regions. So I think it's actually going to take new types of institutions to do that sort of work, and to take it from the planning to the actual investment attraction part. Partly because the investment attraction, sometimes it's large corporates, sometimes it's our local farming communities, sometimes it's research and development. But if we haven't got a good regional institution doing the water planning, water development planning, and transferring that into prioritised investment streams and transferring that into investment, a little bit like they do in the Tassie irrigation model down in Tasmania, then I think we will see slow transition or slow change. If we really want to see major positive development happen, we're going to have to actually lift our regional catchment scale capability to do that. And I think that needs to be really integrated with the energy planning agenda that's coming through.
I think it was interesting you touched on Tasmania there, because the most interesting thing about Tasmania, it's in the last 20 odd years, it's had about 18 dams built. But the most interesting part of that, they've been private initiatives. It's not state government dams, it's been, businesses actually, but they are private investment dams and that. So that was an interesting concept in regards to what's going on down there.
Well, I can talk about that a bit, Bill, because it's really quite important. We looked quite deeply at how Tassie irrigation works and where the strengths and weaknesses are there when we were doing the Bradfield review. And it's one of the reasons I'm so focused on this issue about getting the institutional arrangements right. So Tassie irrigation it's got statutory relationship with government, but it's not a traditional government agency. It has very open relationships with the federal government, with the state government, with the irrigation sector, and with the community. It takes a very strategic approach about what's the right model for development in the catchments. And that's why it's ended up with a lot of smaller, more viable irrigation systems. And it's very good at actually brokering cocktails of investment. So while you're saying they're private, they're not all entirely private. Yeah. Quite often they're a mix of federal, state and private sector money. So sometimes 50, 25, 25, but it does that because it can build partnerships to actually deliver. And it's very hard for the private sector to take the full risk of irrigation infrastructure, large irrigation infrastructure. So I think there's a lot to learn by what happened in Tassie and Tassie irrigation model. And it is no surprise to me that the most significant investments in irrigation infrastructure have been in Tasmania in the last 10 years.
I think the thing is, if it was left up to just the government, nothing would get done. So, like you say, that's where the partnership goes in. But the
Yeah.
initial drive is usually from private enterprise or communities.
Different culture to do this than a traditional government culture. And government's role, of course, is to be the overall steward of the resource and to do the regulatory piece of work in terms of the water planning. But it's not traditionally in the business of facilitating very complex development planning that takes to the investment cycle. That usually means you need a bit of separation from government. You need to be deeply embedded in the region. And it comes back to your theme about lifting the capacity of our regions to do this. You certainly don't want it to be done from Brisbane. And you need to be there for the long haul. Like, it's got to go from the development planning to the options assessment to the business of actually then actively implementing. And my narrative on implementation failure in most governance systems is we're all pretty good at planning, but we can often be quite shit at implementing. And if you don't draw this connection between the planning and options assessment and take that right through to investment attraction and closure, then we'll have a great plan and nothing will happen again. So
I think one of the big problems too, unless it's bipartisan, the thing is some parties probably think, oh, we're in government, but this thing probably not going to happen for another. By the time the ribbon ceremony happens, it's going to be 5, 10 or years down the track. We're not going to be there to cut the ribbon, maybe. So they've got a very short-term focus.
Yep, this stuff is always, even for small development projects, it's always bigger than an election cycle. And it is why, it's why we need to have this stable, long-term institutional sort of arrangement to try to get these things to go from water plans, allocating the water, to actually getting a model for sustainable development that's really going to work. Look, as a Northern Australian, I really celebrate the future we play in really securing that national water security. We're the place, Queensland in particular, North Queensland in particular, is a place where we can drive that national water security into the future, but we can do it in a way that is respectful of 21st century needs. We don't need to go back to the old models of over allocating and then spending billions of dollars trying to fix it up. Let's get it right from the start. We're a smart community, we've got great universities, we've got great bloody industries, we've got people who are prepared to sort of really get together and work these complex issues out. And it's going to take bilateral support to pull that off.
Just talking about the high flow rates of the northern rivers, and I'll just put up a screenshot again.
Yep.
And this is basically what you're talking about, in the times of years when we have high flow and downstream levels and that. And you can see we have different rainfalls over different periods and that. So it's a little bit of a hot shot whether you're going to be guaranteed water flow all the time in your catchment areas. Do you think the other thing is because of the seasonal point and the high flow during the wet season, that we could do a better job of, say, smaller catchment weirs further downstream, like on the Burdekin and that, when you have a big rainfall, well, it fills up and it goes over the sides or whatever and just rushes down to the sea. Do you think there's a place for small weirs either further upstream or further downstream to sort of have holding areas for water? And so development can be, further along the river.
Well, it's one of the reasons I really am supportive of this idea of looking at all the options. And I suspect when we get to the end of that sort of process and we really look at all the options for their strengths and weaknesses, we're probably talking about a range of smaller in-stream caption storage rather than big dams. We're probably also talking a little bit more about where is off-stream storage going to work and where does innovative capture and storage and overland flow going to work. And then you're really starting to get a lot more into the business of actually making the water that's already allocated work better. So research and development in agriculture, really getting that high value, like secondary industries. And, so that every dollar we every megalitre we put into growing something is turning into more and more dollars, through that supply chain system. I think in the context of industrial water and hydrogen development, we're going to have to start looking at where does desalination play a role, particularly, in Townsville, relative to the water allocation, so that you've got that good mix of industry and agriculture. They're things we're going to have to sort of think about for the future. So you can see on that sort of model, Bill, you end up with a long list of things that need to happen, and it's probably going to include the types of things you talk about, so more modest in-stream storage, more innovative off-stream and overland flow storage, and then getting much more innovative about how we use the water that we're allocated now.
Well, just on the hot topic of the Burdekin Dam wall going up 2 metres versus the original stage 2 design, which allowed for 14 metres, 14.6 metres and a spillway. The current plan by Sunwater to raise it 2 metres is a little bit focused on the basis of the future industrial needs of Townsville going forward with industrialisation, like you're talking about as an energy hub and all that sort of thing. But the 2 metre option doesn't really capture anything in regards to hydro that was originally planned. And basically the 2 metres is basically a bastardisation of the dam, so it can never go up to 14 metres. Do you think our predecessors were a bit over enthusiastic for the development of North Queensland by, providing the ability to have that larger wall? Or do you think it's oversight of the current sort of system that you don't take advantage of the pre-planning? Because we've got things like you're in Cairns, the city fathers or years ago had the idea of reserve areas for a ring road around Cairns, which went down Ramsay Street, and basically you could run off somewhere near Warree and get around to Smithfield, and they allocated the land in that. And then someone later on says, well, Cairns is never going to grow, so we'll sell that and put houses on there, and completely ruin the potential for a proper ring road from basically White Rock, Warree to Smithfield. Why do we have people with vision in one area, in one era, and then sort of people who come up and say, well, no, they didn't know what they're doing, we'll change things?
Comes down to quality of leadership, doesn't it, Bill? It's one of the reasons you've got to invest in people and leadership. Sometimes we can go through periods of weaker leadership, and sometimes we can go through periods of stronger leadership. It's why I think, in coming back to that developing Northern Australia agenda, one of the biggest things we need to be focused on is investing in our people, and lifting leadership capability across the north is very important, but lifting workforce capability is as well. Not just focusing on migration solutions, but they're important. They're an important part of that mix. But that means, what's the role of the universities, the TAFE system, the schooling system? I'd want to see in the refresh of the white paper a much stronger sort of focus on the lifting human capability story, and leadership's got to sort of be quite central to that. But yes, it takes leadership to pull off these complex planning agendas. And what distresses me about proposals that jump over the top of that and go against sensible planning decisions is that it distracts us as a regional community for years in trying to progress proposals that could never really happen in the first place. So, and then the opposite is you might actually close up your options if you don't do the planning for things like the ring road. So you may remember, Bill, when I was chair of RDA, I was a very strong advocate for re-institutionalising the conversation about ring road, and that we need to do the upfront planning for that now, and some of that has been achieved, which is great. But I think we need to keep it pretty front and centre of our planning for the city. And we don't need to talk about Coranda Range again today, but my view that we need to be thinking about.
No, well, maybe we can move up to the PDR and a few things like that. But just to finish off on the Burdekin and that, do you sort of think there was enough discussion in regards to raising the wall to 14 metres, or it's not the thing, because at the 14 metre point, I think it almost triples the capacity of the dam. Although I have seen some reports or letters to the editor of Townsville from some geology person that the dam wouldn't be capable, or the footings of it wouldn't be capable of supporting that height, with the water pressure against it, because they think there's a bit of a fault or something in front of the dam wall. Was there any sort of discussion in regards to that?
Yeah. Well, all of that
useful
bits of the discussion about how high should it have been, but let's start with how much water is available. Let's go back to exactly how we sort of thought about the Bradfield stuff. How much water is available? So in that part of the region, around about 150 gigs is potentially available, and 2 meters is pretty close to pulling off that 150 gigs. If you raise it to 14 meters, you're starting to talk not just is the water available for that to happen, a whole lot of cost and engineering related problems, but also the environmental impact and the flooding impact that comes from that as well. So my view is where it landed at 2 meters is probably about the right investment focus, and a lot of the opportunity is with the safety upgrades that need to be done. Those two things can be integrated at a lower cost. So I think we always got to keep in mind that that's just one of the development opportunities in the Burdekin, and there are many others that need to be thought through in association with and additional to that work.
I think the other thing was, when that was built in Joe's area, and they actually bought all the floodplains, and that land's already been allocated. The extra that's got to flood, that's already been, doesn't need a environmental survey or anything. That's actually was all done before. So my way of thinking is the more water we can pull, water is life, and so we've got more life in our system. But and the other way, doesn't mean it's going to fill up every year. It might take a series of years to fill up to that. But that's the general consensus, is that 14 meters will give you 3 times the storage. And whether it takes 5 or what years to get that, gradually increase it to that level, you get the hydro and you guarantee. Anyway, that's a simplistic look. Maybe we can come back to a discussion on that.
That's why water plans are so important, Bill, because it's great in theory to just capture the water, but the moment we start capturing water, we have an impact somewhere, and the whole water planning process is about coming up with the right balance to say, if we take more water than this, how are we going to start impacting irrigators lower down? If we start taking more than this, how are we going to start impacting those ecosystems and floodplains that are actually really crucial? It's that balancing thing, and the water planning framework is the best we have. It may not be perfect, but it's the best way we have to have a serious conversation about how do we not turn the Burdekin into a Murray-Darling Mark II. So,
okay, if we can just move on to the PDR and a few things that you're interested in there, because we've gone over the hour. Do you want to give us an update of I always think the Kuranda Range Road is part of the whole system for a sort of economic corridor to the Cape. But do you think just upgrading the current PDR and infrastructure up there is enough, or do you think we need to include the Port of Cairns in the conversation?
So there's a bit of history to this about how the money actually was allocated into the PDR originally, and there was great advocacy work done by people in the peninsula. So you remember Trish Butler, who's run Cape York Sustainable Futures, and many other key leaders from the communities around the Cape really put a huge amount of advocacy into why it was important to actually get better transport linkages into Cape York Peninsula and to the remote communities on the east and west coast. But the reason we got a significant amount of investment in this region into initially the Bruce Highway, so it came about because the 4 RDAs, Regional Development Australia boards, in Far North Queensland, Torres Strait, Northwest Queensland, and Central Queensland and Mackay Whitsunday all got together and said, we have more influence on budget if we're talking 1 million people instead of 250,000. And we all worked with the state government very well and very closely with the federal government. We got, at that stage, I think under the Newman government was about $1 billion was allocated into the Bruce Highway Action Plan. And through Anthony Albanese, we had strong support for this idea of influencing the Transport Infrastructure Agreement, Partnership Agreement. And that ended up with about $8.9 billion of investment into the Bruce Highway. And I would always just argue, Bill, a bit like you'd say, Bruce Highway finishes at Weipa, if not NPA.
It's not Gympie.
So that was where, on the back of that, the first iteration of investment in Cape York infrastructure package happened. And I've been chairing the Cape York infrastructure package task force and sub-working group ever since then. So the first generation was about, this is a big job, it's a big job, both in terms of getting the spine of the PDR done, plus getting the access to remote Indigenous communities. So the first package was what we call the quick wins. So those bits of relatively stable parts of the road that can be done at a relatively low cost and relatively easy technically, and in investment in what was called the CEMA package, which is Cape York Indigenous Mayors Alliance in those days package, before Torres and Cape Indigenous Councils Alliance. So those councils have had investment now in doing a lot of the access roads to the PDR, as well as other transport issues. And that was a pretty successful first round. We worked really hard to make sure we got the best local employment outcomes, Indigenous employment outcomes, and local contracting. And never perfect, but it's much better than what would have happened had we not had that sort of good governance led from within the region in partnership with the Commonwealth and the states. Second stage is starting to do the harder stuff. So the harder bits of work, and starting to get serious about the design and construction of some of the key bridges. The third phase is going to be the harder bits again. So one of the reasons, like you're saying, you see once you start deviating a lot of road access, that's also a very big, massive increase in cost as well. So it's hard times in terms of getting the job done, but it's getting the job done probably cheaper and more effectively than would be the case otherwise. So I'm very confident we'll get to a stage 3, which will take us into that much harder territory. That long term, what's the link between Weipa and NPA? That needs to be part of the process. At the same time, we're keeping, enough four-wheel drive sort of opportunities for people to continue to get that Cape York experience into the future as well.
Well, some things, like the people in Weipa, I don't think they're that much in favour of the good PDR, because they want to keep the riffraff out and keep the fishing to themselves, talking to them up there anyway. But the other thing, for most people, projects like, you look at the Transcontinental Railway in the United States, start at both ends and at the middle and just kept going. They didn't do a bit in the middle and a bit here. To me, I don't know if the way that they're doing it is the most efficient. I'm the person that sort of thinks, well, start at one end and just keep going.
Yeah,
if you've got a population centre at the other end.
I'm a bit closer to the planning of that stuff, Bill, and there's a lot of reasons it's happening the way it's happening,
But it's a project in progress, but gee whiz, it's a long time coming. Anyway,
well, you got to go back to Trisha's original vision of this. What was it? It was around about a 10-15 year vision, and I think we'll probably get there within the 10 to 15 years. But that was pretty ambitious vision at that stage, and she'd be happy in her grave, I think, thinking about the progress that's been made on that original vision.
Well, let's hope for the people of the Cape it does come to fruition, and those sort of corridors, they just give you the potential for economic development, and that's what we need first and foremost. Give the infrastructure that creates potential for private people to come in and invest in that and grow the pie, because with all our governments all in debt and that, we desperately need to grow the pie so we can pay some of that debt back somewhere along the line.
We're already seeing some of the economic benefits emerging, in terms of investment attraction and, much greater economic sort of turnover. we've still got to make sure we're doing the right thing to protect those fantastic natural assets we've got in the Cape that are key to the tourism economy and that are nationally and globally significant. But, you know, at the same time, we've got a lot of people in poverty in Cape York and people looking for economic development. So it's again about trying to get that balance right,
Oh, and the other thing is we have to get all those roadblocks out the way. Maybe if we can just add something to our projects like PDF advantage to reducing climate change or something, and that will make all the difference in the way it's funded or pushed, because it seems if you put renewable energy in front of a project or climate change, it seems to get a bit of spin in regards to removing some of the barriers.
I like to reclaim the development word, Bill. You know, like development is not just about economic development. It's about getting all of the bits right. It's something better.
Yeah.
We've got, you know, economic development that, you know, manages our environmental assets and you know, gets over some of that sort of deep economic disadvantage. That's good development. It's something better. We do something that stuffs up the environment, that's not good. And if we do something that keeps people poor and marginalised and disadvantaged, while certain people just get lots of value out of it, that's not good either. So, you know, we've got to, they're tough things that we've got to work through. And again, I remain optimistic, you know, as I get a bit older, that we can pull that off. But it takes leadership and it takes a lot of thinking and planning.
Yeah, well, I think it takes a lot of northern leadership. I think that's the key got to be the key component, because if we don't have that, we're just going to have people in the ivory towers of Brisbane and Canberra making the decisions for us, and sometimes I don't think they get it right.
Well, that could be a subject of another conversation, Bill.
That's it. Okay, look, I'd like to thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. If you can just stay on the line for a little bit, and I'll introduce the next episode, and then we'll have a quick chat. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks all.
Alan. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube page. We're actually going to have a special episode tomorrow afternoon at noon. We're going to have a talk to Matthew Sweeney, the president of the Chamber of Commerce in Tamworth. Tamworth is going to be the focus on Friday of the first Bush Summit in politics. We'll have the Prime Minister there have a keynote speech, and the Bush Summit is going to go around to all states and end up in Rockhampton on the 18th. So we'll speak to Matthew Sweeney tomorrow and see how they're making ready for the preparations for Friday's Bush Summit in Tamworth. Thank you.